Rob Delves, welcome to the Pacey Performance Podcast. It's a pleasure to have you.
Rob, thank you very much, mate, for having me on. It's a pleasure to be with you.
We were talking beforehand, and this podcast, this episode is going to be about Power BI and the power of Power BI and how it can about automations and visualizations, all that kind of stuff. But this is a growing area, and it probably has been for the last 5-10 years in terms of looking for alternatives to Excel to communicate data, to create stories, all that kind of stuff. So I'm really excited to get you on. I know you've been peppered on LinkedIn for some of the stuff that you've been putting on recently, which has been great. Hence, I'm one of the peppering people. So it's great to get you on. But Rob, if anyone doesn't know who you are, would you mind just giving us a bit of a bio on you, a brief bio?
Absolutely, Rob, and no problems about the peppering. More than happy to be peppered. So Rob Delves, sports scientist at the Melbourne Storm rugby league club here in Melbourne, in Australia. I've been a sports scientist since 2018. So basically fresh out of uni into the Melbourne Storm. And so my role there is basically typical of what you'd expect with sports science. It'd be the athlete load monitoring, bit of testing, bit of gym work as well. So that's basically the general premise. And now more and more it's got that data analysis side to it. So a lot more of a data emphasis and basically the resident sort of data scientist in our physical performance team.
How is that role developing in the NRL? Are clubs getting dedicated people? So you're not on the S&C side, you're not kind of the assisting, but you're just data stuff. Is that the way it's going?
I think it varies on your resources at the NRL level. I don't think we're probably is particularly well resourced as what you'd find maybe in Premier League in clubs and stuff like that. I think that it's probably like follows the general narrative of being a sports scientist, and that you have to develop these skill sets on the fly and sort of adapt and become your own in-house data scientist, because I don't think that many people would probably have that exclusively within the NRL, to be honest. So I think, as I said, it's probably a necessary evil that you have to try and upskill yourself to be proficient.
That's probably exactly it, the necessary evil, because it gives you other skills to be able to communicate what you're doing, and you know what that S&C coach may want or need. You know what other coaches may need because you've been involved in them in other capacities versus just sitting behind a laptop dealing with the data.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's probably the most powerful thing, is that if you have the contextual awareness as to what's going on as well. Like if you have the knowledge of what the data actually means, and that's probably more powerful than having an in-house data scientist anyway, in some regard, because the context of that data is the meaningful part of the interpretation. So having somebody who knows the physiology behind it, or the biomechanics behind what you're collecting, is probably the trade-off and the win, I guess, from having somebody in my role, I guess.
100%. So, right, let's dive into Power BI. Why do you think there's been this interest in this particular bit of software? Why do you think we've moved towards or away from standard Excel?
Well, so for me, this has probably been a 5-year process, I think, because I think I got to a point where we were collecting so much data from different places. So like your GPS, heart rate, might be RPEs or, body weight, skin folds, all these different things. So the standard place that you would historically warehouse that would be Excel. But unfortunately, what tends to happen, or what happened to us, is that eventually gets a bit worn down or breaks down or whatever, or can't handle the load. So you need to find a solution that can encompass all of that in the one place, and you can sort of basically use that as a warehouse or a place where you can streamline all your data into, to then do something meaningful with on the back end. So I think everybody's probably feeling that same challenge of, we've got so much pieces of tech that we collect data from, we export all this data, but how do we actually get it in the one place that's going to be easy to access and easy to visualize off the back of?
So for those that aren't quite there yet, Excel literally just starts to slow down.
Yeah, so what can happen? So GPS is a common one. So the GPS files, like a 10 hertz file or even some sort of summary file, after a while, it will just go very, very slow. You'll see basically the frozen screen of death appear, and then it'll basically just break and say, Microsoft Office or Excel has stopped working. But that's the telltale sign that it can't handle the load anymore. And that is becoming probably more and more common because the data set's becoming bigger and bigger. So that's when you know it's time to have a look at something else, which is sort of where Power BI thankfully can come in.
So for those who are kind of stuck in Excel and are maybe thinking about alternatives because of maybe things like that, is there any reason why someone would stick to Excel? What is Excel really good at, which would allow or give people or listen to this and go, no, I'm going to stick where I am because I think this does this really well? What does Excel do well?
Also, I think the first thing, the golden rule, I think, Rob, is that if you've got something that works for you and you're happy with the time it takes and the processes around it are fine, then don't change it. Like if you've got a good system in place that you're happy with, don't change it just for the sake of changing it. That's probably the first thing. So that probably leads into what Excel's good at. Excel's good because a lot of people know how to use it. It's almost universal in that everybody sort of knows and how to navigate around a spreadsheet, particularly an Excel spreadsheet anyway. So like Excel, it's good for that basic data entry. So if you're looking at, just one aspect of your performance program, whether that be player weights or skin folds or something, and you want to just track that in one place, then Excel's probably appropriate to do that, depending on, where you're at, what your level is, and what resources that you have available to you. So I guess from that perspective, it's basic, it's easy, you know how to use it, but then the familiarity aspect is probably the pull that keeps people coming back to it. And I don't necessarily blame them for that either, to be honest, because sometimes, particularly with software, it's better the devil you know.
So why did you turn to Power BI? Obviously, the what you mentioned earlier in terms of Excel slowing down and just becoming a little bit not big enough for you to do what you wanted to do. But why Power BI and not other alternatives? And we'll get on to what those other alternatives are later. But why Power BI?
Yeah, it's a good question, and there's a lot of different aspects that probably go into this, Rob, that you probably wouldn't consider straight off the top. But the first one is that I wanted to create an app where all of our physical performance team could access that whenever they wanted it on demand. And there's a couple of ways you can go about that. There's people do things like an R Shiny app, which is if you're very good at R, you can make an app basically custom made, but that was a little bit too time consuming. You have to learn how to, set that up. But the beauty with Power BI is that it had that sort of functionality already inbuilt, whereas like it gave you the blank canvas and then you just needed to draw upon it and then upload that to an already installed server. So from the hardware perspective and trying to get that in an automated app, that was probably the first tick, I would say. And then the second aspect on this is probably the organizational aspect from a budgeting point of view. Like for us, Power BI was more cost effective because our organization already used the Microsoft Office suite of products, which is it's just definitely something you need to consider when you're looking to some of these resources, is the finances available to you and the resources available to you. So for us, that was probably a better option than Tableau, just because it was a bit more cost effective. So you could basically get that on board easier with other departments. And then lastly, it was just the familiarity with Excel off the back of that. So the interface, which is a jargon word they use in data science, a user interface, which is basically the layout of your software, was, replicated Excel. So was familiar off the back of that. So they're probably the different portions there as to why that was a pull towards the Power BI.
So when you talk about the app and having something accessible for the coaches, what was it? The problem was that they didn't have access to this, but what was the kind of conversation, or was it a move away from printing things off and giving it to them in the office? What was the sticking point there to lead you to go, we need an app that's accessible for everyone?
Yeah, good question. So obviously the physical handing out of reports and stuff gets a bit tedious as well. But I think it was just having a uniform place where everybody could access that one thing at any different time point. Because again, if you set something up in Excel, then you have to warehouse that somewhere where everyone can access it, which can be problematic if somebody who doesn't necessarily know what they're doing goes on there and edits a file or changes the file location or something like that, and then everything breaks off that. So again, it's probably just having that one uniform place where it's accessible to everyone, and only the person who's running it can manage the settings on it so it doesn't break. And then it doesn't, just because if you've changed it doesn't mean it changes for everybody else as well. So that's probably the two main reasons why that is. And then obviously the luxury of accessing things when you want, as opposed to being emailed for something or contacted for something late at night as a sports scientist after a game or training, is probably the other thing as well. Like if you can have that set up for someone so they can go home and look at something, that's a bit better for you as well. So it's just there and they can access it at their leisure.
So do you have an athlete management system as well as Power BI, or is Power BI in the system that you've created your AMS?
No, so basically for us, Power BI is our AMS. And again, that was through like budgetary constraints and financial considerations. And by the time we'd probably gotten around to having a look at an AMS, I'd developed Power BI to a stage where it was basically good enough as an AMS, to be honest. Like it had everything we needed in there, and anything that we didn't have, I could custom build, to be honest. And so far, we haven't really had too many issues in trying to build something from the ground up that the Power BI couldn't handle, essentially. So yeah, it was in the works, and then basically, thankfully, we kept putting work into it, and now it's our AMS by proxy.
So one big selling point of a couple of AMS, well, many AMSs out there, is the medical side of things and things being secure. Do you run your medical stuff through that as well, or is that housed somewhere different?
No, the medical stuff is, and for the consideration you just said, is warehoused differently. We'll put our sort of rehab testing and stuff like that on there, still from a physical basis, but anything in terms of like medical records and stuff, that's still kept on a dedicated AMS platform, but that is like a league given thing as well for us in the NRL. So that's a league resource that's provided to our medical staff, which is a good thing. And so we can sort of just still warehouse the non-confidential sort of rehab based data on our version of AMS essentially.
Yeah, I thought it may have been a league thing. So in terms of cost, like probably 99% of people out there working on laptops and things have got Microsoft Office or Office 365. What additional cost is there to run Power BI, if any?
It's a great question, to be honest, because I'm not 100% sure on what it is for us, because we've got a few different licenses and stuff like that. So it's basically, it's cheap enough that our accounting department like it, but I'm not exactly sure. But what happens is, for the licensing, is that you basically tack on a Power BI Pro license to your Microsoft Office suite of products. So that's how it actually gets put on, is it basically gets added onto your account as an extra suite of functionality on your Microsoft Office suite of products. But as for the exact cost, I'm not 100% sure what it is per user.
Understood. No worries, mate. Right. So you've mentioned the similarities with Excel, but let's dive into the weeds of how it actually does differ from Excel, from a user perspective, from a housing of the data, like where is it, how do you get it, all the intricacies of differentiation between the two.
Yeah, exactly. So this is probably a multifaceted part of the question. So I might go on a bit of a tangent here, but so Excel is basically you like your data comes into a spreadsheet, and then you would store it in a sheet, and you probably got columns, rows of data of whatever's meaningful to you, and then you can set up some sort of reporting off that. You can do things like pivot tables, where you can basically store your stats and data, and you can alter that and do some basic manipulation all in that spreadsheet, as long as it's connected to your original data source. And then you can do the same things with charts and visualizations, which are relatively at a very basic level. And basically all of that is contained within a spreadsheet. Like you can add other spreadsheets and links into that, and you can get some outside sources within that one spreadsheet in Excel, and you can do some things with that. But again, that will get bogged down with links and different workbook locations and stuff like that. So that's probably Excel in a nutshell, where it's good for that simplistic stuff where you have maybe one or two sources of data comes in, you can do some basic manipulations with it. Where Power BI sort of builds on top of that is that it's a multifactorial, basically a warehouse of where you can put your data in from. So you can have your Excel spreadsheets directly fed into Power BI. You can have things from APIs and data warehouses and stuff, and they can all feed into Power BI. And the big difference there is that everything's in the one location. And so then you can then drag and drop, play around, mix and match with different data sources within the one workspace, essentially. So all of a sudden you can group all these different data points from various different sheets and locations into one, so you can have a little bit more in-depth analysis of the things that are meaningful to you, essentially. So that's probably the biggest thing from like that data visualization and manipulation point of view, that you can go one step beyond that. And then the analysis within Power BI is probably a little bit better. You can start doing things like DAX code, which again is a little bit more complicated, but that's basically like scripting where you can sort of manipulate the data sets you've installed and do other things with that. And then the charting from a visualization point of view is a little bit more sophisticated than Excel, more options there and more functionality to drag and drop and play around with different things.
So from a security perspective, because obviously if you've got Excel, all the data's hosted locally on your computer. As long as your computer doesn't get stolen, it's yours. Where is this held? And is security ever an issue?
So security is obviously a big consideration for any organization, really, considering the current climate. But so Power BI is good in the fact that you can keep it in house in terms of your organization. So everybody's still got that multi-factor authentication. Going well here, Rob.
Authentication. I'll help you.
Yeah, thanks, mate. Beautiful. Yeah, so because everybody's got that, so there's still that two-step process to get in, so people can access. So people can't access that unless they're supposed to. So that's a good thing about that. And then again, just from probably a user point of view, that their username and password is still associated with their organizational account. So for my example, it's still associated with my Storm account, still my Storm username and password. So from that perspective, it's still got that. It's a bit user friendly and it's still backed by the organization's security.
So what's the learning curve like on Power BI for someone that's a half decent Excel user, like familiar with it, all that kind of thing, familiar with Microsoft? What's the learning curve for someone to get up to speed with Power BI and moving away from Excel?
Mate, to be honest, I think it's pretty good, because like when I first started using the software, it was almost like, oh wow, this is actually really similar to Excel in the way it's laid out, which I think that's good, like mentally, because if you see something you think, oh, this is familiar, it won't take me too long to sort of navigate around. So it's not as if it's a complete shock to the senses when you see something that's completely vast and different, like you would if you opened up an R Studio Code window or something like that. So I think that having that familiarity already installs a greater level of patience that you will pick it up and get it because you've seen something like this before. So off the back of Excel, I'd say it didn't take me too long to get a hand. Sorry. So it didn't take me too long to get a handle on it, but it was just a basic thing of trial and error, to be honest. Like just playing around with the different the plug and play features and stuff like that. Like once the data was actually in there and you could see and access it, then it was just playing around and just basically doing a bit of experimenting, to be honest.
So in terms of what is the plug and play stuff, well, what can you go in there? Once your data is in there, what options is Power BI giving you on the surface before you go into the DAX code and start really getting to grips with it? What's on that surface level to help people in that familiarity side of things?
Yeah, for sure, for sure. So it basically pulls. So if we're talking from an Excel spreadsheet point of view, it would basically pull in. If you have a spreadsheet, say you've got GPS data as your spreadsheet, right? And every column in that spreadsheet is basically then a plug and play feature in Power BI. So if you've got distance, for example, as a column, then you can just pull that in and you can put that in as an x-axis or a y-axis variable, whatever it is. But it's basically just using the column of whatever the column is in your spreadsheet in Power BI. So then you can manipulate that in and around of where you want. So it's basically when people say plug and play or drag and drop, it's basically dragging the distance column into a visualization or into a part of the visualization, whether that be the x-axis, y-axis, or a row or column in a table within Power BI.
One thing that you brought up on the little conversation we had before we pressed record, it was around automation. And one big thing that I find quite amusing is on when you see on social media around people learning to code, and maybe the older generation of coaches, maybe that's the best way to put it, may question the applicability of learning to code or using software like a Power BI for coaches, because it takes people off the floor. It means it's added work. Like, the whole point of these things is to do the work up front to then save time to do other things, to communicate and have a chat with your head coach about the data that's taking you 10% of the time to generate and all them kind of things. So from your perspective, how has Power BI helped with saving time through the creation of automations?
Oh, it's massive, Rob, to be honest. It's like once everything's set up and you've got all your processes in place, it's basically a process of, like, say if an outdoor training session's done, like as soon as you go back in and download all of your data from your GPS tech or whatever it might be, and you sync all that data, it's basically there within the Power BI interface or the Power BI database to then be viewed upon in the app. So it takes away a lot of the old school things of cutting and importing into spreadsheets or whatnot. So, like, for example, if I'm doing a training session, I come back, download all that data, that process is probably not even an hour from finishing the training paddock to getting data up in the cloud and on Power BI for other coaches to have a look at. So they can then, if we have a gym session that afternoon and they're talking to a player, they're like, oh, this is what you did today, this morning, you hit 90% of your max speed or whatever it might be. So there's some of the early wins that we've got. And then I think for me, it frees me up to be able to go in the gym if we have a gym session after a training or whatever, and knowing that my workflow isn't impacted because the data's already there and it's already been reported upon and it's already accessible for the people who need it as well. So it definitely does free up my time to do other things and other projects that I want to do, and then also, like, I see my role as a bit of an analyst or a bit of an assistant to our conditioning and strength guys as well. So, like, they don't have to touch any of that stuff. Like, that's ready and there for them, so they can just coach and give feedback to players and stuff like that. They don't have to worry about punching in numbers at the end of their day, like after a training session or whatever. Like, that stuff's there for them as well, which is just as important, so they can still focus on the thing that they're good at, which is coaching.
One thing that you mentioned was, I think you said about RPE. Are you able to create user forms to collect RPEs almost hassle-free? Then that feeds back into Power BI.
So like we typically haven't really done that. To be honest, our philosophy, we sort of steer away from the subjective data. So from that perspective, we haven't really done too much with player forms or anything like that we've given players access to. But I'm not sure whether that's something you'd probably want to do in Power BI necessarily as well. I think you'd probably want to keep that stuff a little bit separate if you're giving it to a player to then access from. But like for us personally, we've sort of steered clear of that and just made it more of a sort of performance staff or physical performance staff only thing that we can access.
this wasn't the topic of the conversation, but why have you moved away from the subjectives? And when you mentioned that, I don't know if it was Lackland that had mentioned that on the podcast when he came on a while ago, or whether it was someone else, maybe Darren Burgess, maybe potentially. But yeah, why have you moved away from that?
Well, Rob, from experience, the athletes are very smart in telling you what they think you want to hear, and or what somebody else has said. So, like with RPE, like you always see instances where people do the old clipboard thing end of training, and players come up and tell you, "Oh, this was a 6 today or a 7," and then somebody else will come along and say, "Well, what did he say it was? Or what did they say it was?" So, the actual meaningful data from it probably wasn't that great, to be honest. The validity probably wasn't that great, and like we didn't want to, I guess, create an environment where players thought they had to, be untruthful as to how they're actually feeling or what they thought they wanted us to hear. Basically, like it just wasn't really moving the needle for us, to be honest.
Interesting. So, how many sources of data are you actually pulling into Power BI? And is there? You mentioned APIs. Are they easy to set up? Does that help? Again, that I'm guessing that helps with creating time for you to do all the things that you just mentioned as well.
Yeah, exactly. So, like a typical API thing would be like Catapult data, for example. So we use Catapult as our GPS provider, and so we do have that functionality where that's sort of automated through us, but that's again using an API that I've created and using R as well as a bit of a middleman to get that into Power BI. So the con with Power BI would be that you have to make your own APIs and you have to figure out ways of basically getting that API into Power BI versus the pro of having an AMS from a third-party proprietary software is that though that API process is more streamlined and is straight in. So because it's not cost effective for us to do that, I've had to learn how to try and get APIs into Power BI, which to be honest isn't easy. If you're a sports scientist with a physiology background like myself, it's not the easiest thing in the world to be able to learn to do. But again, as I said earlier, it's part of that necessary evil that if this is all you've got, then this is how you need to learn and get around things. But again, the premise of the API is, as you said, that you can feed data through automatically, and then that's what speeds up or it basically improves your data flow where you can get things to people pretty quickly. So obviously Catapult's that for us, and then Vald as well. So Vald is the force frame, force decks, all that sort of stuff that comes into our AMS via Power BI as well. So they're probably the two main ones that you associate with APIs, and then I have like other little things that feed into there, like different points. So like skin folds and weight data, and dabble in a bit of tactical stuff as well. So like they're probably the two main API examples anyway.
Is there any sticking points when you're trying to do that with certain technologies that wouldn't work in terms of pulling the API in, given that it's a manual thing versus an agreed automatic thing through a traditional AMS?
Yeah, that's the tough thing is trying to find out whether that API is accessible or whether they have that first and foremost, whether they have that functionality, and then whether you can get it into Power BI. Like thankfully, fingers crossed, we haven't actually come across that yet. But I do think with the wave of technology and the development, Rob, that's coming, I don't think that's necessarily going to be too much of a problem from here on in. And obviously, like we're doing it ourselves DIY. So if you've got a third party or an actual software, then you wouldn't even have to think about or worry about that because it's taken care of. But I think with the continued investment in the data science within sports science, and I think that's probably going to be a non-existent issue probably as it gets developed.
You mentioned R and using R as the kind of go-between for the API. What additional functionality, usability, all that kind of stuff would you get having learned R?
I think a greater appreciation as to how to properly manipulate data. I think and the automation around that as well, cleaning the data, manipulating it, and then converting it into some sort of like usable, usable format from there. So if you have those R skills in place, then like it definitely gives you a bit of a leg up. But then Power BI also do have some sort of R integrations as well, where you can, if you know your R code, then you can do things within Power BI off the back of that as well. So if you have that knowledge of R, which is typically it's a statistical product. So you have things like R and Python. Python's really good for building and creating apps and stuff like that. And R's probably more suited towards that stats environment as well. So if you've got a good foundation in that, then it can definitely give you a good boost along within Power BI as well. But definitely a solid grounding in manipulation and visualization.
Nice. So on that visualization, what are your principles when it comes to visualization? Because this visualization is a whole topic within itself, but what are your principles?
That's a good question. I've done this a million different ways, to be honest. I think the best way that people have suggested and I've seen is that you have a question that you want to answer. So you start from there, whatever your research question is, if you want to put it in those terms, or whatever the question is that you want to answer, you start from there. And then I would probably just draw it out on a piece of paper, like a lot of people do that, but just draw out like an A4 piece of paper of what you want on there and the information you want to see and how you envisage it to look. That's probably a good start of trying to map together a dashboard, I guess. But then I've also done it the flip side, where I've seen something from a different field or business or whatever and think, oh, that could actually answer this question that I had in the back of my mind. So like a practical example of that, I put this up on a LinkedIn post as well, which isn't like a shameless self-promotion, but like I was looking for flights. During off season for a holiday, and this travel company basically had conditionally formatted the prices of flights to indicate how expensive they were, whether that was, red was really expensive or whatever. And I thought about that as like a calendar view for some of our players and what their loads were during the week, because I think player loads on a calendar is easy to conceptualize because you can see where their rest days are within the week and you don't just look at individual training days. So then I thought, why don't I color code them depending on their volume for that day and see how that looks. So it's actually been really useful for us at the moment. Like particularly we have State of Origin going on now. So we have a couple of players who are in that. So looking at their loads and stuff like that, it's been really useful for that. So that was from me looking at something else and then bringing that back in to answer a question that I hadn't answered yet. So the two flip sides of the coin are maybe start off with something that you want to visualize or just be open to some divine inspiration, I guess.
You mentioned Tableau a little bit ago, and I just want to make sure that we cover it before I do let you go in 5 or 10 minutes. Apart from the cost side of Tableau, why would someone go down the Power BI route versus the Tableau route?
Well, I think we've touched on it. The main probably themes that you have the familiarity with Microsoft Office and Excel or whatnot. I think if that's not to say that you can't just go off and use Tableau. Like a lot of people use Tableau. A lot of my friends use Tableau and they do some really cool creative stuff with it. It's just learning just with only having experience of Tableau. So I just think for the vast majority of people, and particularly the ad demographic, if you don't have an access to a sports scientist or a data scientist or whatever in your organization and Excel, then it's probably an easier jump, as I said, to jump on Power BI as opposed to Tableau, which might be a little bit more daunting because you've never seen that style of interface before or whatnot. But I think the familiarity and pull from what you already know is probably going to be the thing.
How, given the fact that this shift was made because of the need for an app and have accessibility from coaches, what's their feedback been like because of this, because of the move to Power BI?
Well, I think for us, it's been pretty good, to be honest. As I said, for our coaches anyway, it allows them to look at things that they think is interesting as well. So our physical performance team. So I'll give you a quick rundown of like our team and sort of the different areas that they sort of interact with Power BI. So Lachlan Penfold, who's our head of performance, like he would gravitate towards our GPS data and look at that or whatever. But the functionality within Power BI like allows him to manipulate things that he wants to see within the parameters as well. So it still gives him that freedom to look at things that he wants to look at that like he might not get if I just send a PDF with whatever's happened from training that day. So I think that the biggest win for them has been that they still get a little bit of freedom to manipulate what they want, but they can still still have the bones of what's provided as well. So it allows them to explore some different things in their own time as well.
Has there been any feature in particular within Power BI that's really caught on, or is it just that ability of freedom for coaches, technical and tactical and the performance guys, to do what they want and explore and have a little look and dive deeper into one area versus you're getting what you're given on a print off paper version?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's basically it's like the Netflix of data reporting. It's sort of on demand. You can see what you want, and then you can manipulate it. And like that, as you said, that's probably the biggest win, because I still think the basic features and functionality aren't anything that's drastically different, but having the power to do what you want with it is probably the thing that keeps them coming back. And like you can still export things into Excel as well for Power BI. Like if you find a report you like, you can still export the data within that into Excel, and you can still use a spreadsheet to your heart's content as well. So it's still got that room to play around, do whatever, but rip the data out if you want to do something else with it as well.
And my final question for you, Rob, is on the tactical side. So bringing in video, what does that look like, and how does that fit with where you want to go with Power BI?
Yeah, it's probably a little bit tricky, to be honest, because I think the video side, like for tactical, that's very probably very bogged down in traditional structures and traditional players with that, to be honest. Like I think that like companies are coming in and getting better at probably amalgamating the wearable tech with the video side. But for us personally, I haven't really gone down the video side with Power BI, to be honest. I've still got tactical data within it, which is statistical based stuff, but I haven't really gone down that video side that you would with traditional video analysis and analysts with coaches or whatnot. I don't think Power BI necessarily would be that point of call for analysts based on what they already have now with the different proprietary players that they have at the moment.
Understood. Well, you've mentioned LinkedIn a few times. No shameless plugs. There's no shameless plugs here, Rob, so don't worry about that. So you've put some stuff on LinkedIn, which has been great. But is there anywhere else that people can see your work, get in touch? Like, where's the best place people get in touch with you if they want to chat Power BI or anything else?
Probably still LinkedIn, to be honest, with the Power BI stuff. I'm trying to post on there maybe once a fortnight or once every 10 days and just try and give people some inspiration as to what they can do with some stuff and try and think outside the box a little bit. So, as I said, I'll probably post on there for the rest of the season, maybe once every 10 days or 2 weeks with some stuff there. And if people want to reach out to me off the back of that, then please do. But that's definitely the right place or port of call, Rob, if I want to be peppered anyway.
Perfect. Well, Rob, thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate it. I know it's always an interesting one, lining up time zones and whatnot from Oz and here in the UK. But really appreciate it, and look forward to seeing more on LinkedIn. And look forward to chatting more.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you for having me on, mate. It's a pleasure to come on. It was touching that you invited me. So thanks very much. And yeah, it's you're doing good things with the podcast and the Sportsmith brand. So well done.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that. Cheers, Rob.